Radio Westeros, Episode 87, The Night's Watch After the Conquest.
Spoilers all books!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Radio Westeros. I'm one of your hosts, Lady Guinevere, and with me is Yolkboy.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have a really exciting episode prepared, focusing on the modern era of the Night's Watch, from Aegon's conquest onwards, including a walkthrough of the Watch in the main story and a look at the wonderful cast of characters at the Wall. We've done an episode on the ancient era of the Night's Watch, so this is the second installment, but if you haven't listened to that one, don't worry, as this will stand alone just fine.
And first off here, we'll look at the slow decline of the Night's Watch. The organization was formed thousands of years ago to defend the realm from the others, but with no icy demons in sight, they began to lose sight of their purpose. We'll consider what happened and why as we focus on the Targaryen era.
The decline didn't occur in a straight line though, as we'll see when Queen Alysanne visits the Wall and sees life through the eyes of a Night's Watch recruit. The men of the Watch were suitably impressed by her dragon, Silverwing, although the dragon refused to fly beyond the Wall. Stay tuned for a rundown of Alysanne's trip.
And after that, we'll talk about the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons when the Night's Watch were on their knees and left starving. We'll learn that when the Watch are weak, the free folk grow bold, a theme which carries on into the main story.
After our look at life at the Wall under the Targaryens, we'll consider what happened after Robert Baratheon destroyed the dynasty and became king. We'll look at Benjen Stark's decision to join the Watch and wonder how he got on with Maester Aemon given what transpired between their houses during the rebellion.
And then we'll get to the main story when Jon Snow joins the Watch, searching for honor. While his initial disappointment with the declining Watch stings, soon he finds a family at Castle Black, with Samwell, Pip, Gren, and the hilarious Ed Tollett. We'll give a special focus to these and more memorable characters at the Wall.
But some characters are memorable for the wrong reasons, and so we'll look at Chet the Steward's mutinous plans on the Great Ranging, which was a low point in the Watch's long fall from grace. Back at Castle Black, though, there is hope that the Watch can be galvanized once more, as Jon Snow is elected Lord Commander, making a series of major decisions to try and prepare the Black Brothers for the inevitable war against the others. And we'll top it off by discussing Jon's stabbing and what comes next for the Watch during the Winds of Winter.
But before we begin with the Night's Watch, we want to note a milestone here at Radio Westeros. June of 2024 marks 10 years since we released our first episode on Arya Stark and the Mercy Chapter. We are firm believers that success takes a village, and we want to thank each and every listener who has supported us in one way or another during this past decade, and of course, all of our patrons, past and present. We truly could not do this without you all. So, thanks to the Radio Westeros community, and to our current patrons, including our Flaming Lightbringer patron, TJ Harrington, our Dragonsteel patron, Peter, and our Pale as Milk Glass patrons, Alex, Akka and the Company of the Cats, Crispy the Song of Ice, Seth, Kelly, Laura, Sister Winter, Moltude, John Wergarian, and MT Walls, first of his name, as well as B-Word and Mr. J, the Bear and the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jib Jab Hot Dog Shop. House motto, we forge the chains we wear in life.
Yeah, thanks everyone. With your help, we'll continue bringing you episodes all about the amazing characters, institutions, and events that fill the pages of A Song of Ice and Fire for many years to come. And now, let's get started with our look at the Night's Watch after the Conquest. The vast expense in sustaining the Wall and the men who man it has become increasingly intolerable. Only 3 of the castles of the Night's Watch are now manned, and the order is a tenth of the size that it was when Aegon and his sisters landed, yet even at this size, the Watch remains a burden.
In the decades, centuries, and even millennia following the Long Night, the Night's Watch waxed in power, appealing to small folk and highborn alike, offering a life of admirable duty and honor to those who chose to guard the realms of men. At its apex, the Watch consisted of over 10,000 men, and Castle Black alone once boasted 5,000 recruits. In the current story, however, the numbers are a tenth that size. The organization is viewed by many outside the North as a burden, and its reputation for honor has diminished. So before we focus on the current story of the Night's Watch, let's consider the modern history of the organization, beginning with Aegon's conquest, which brought about so many changes in Westeros.
And while it might seem straightforward to say the decline of the Watch began in the Targaryen era, the truth is more complex, as reflected in this quote from Maester Yandel in the World Book. The history of the Night's Watch is a long one. Tales still tell of the Black Knights of the Wall and their noble calling. But the age of heroes is long done, and the others have not shown themselves in thousands of years, if indeed they ever existed. And so, year by year, the Watch has dwindled. Their own records prove that this decline has been in progress even before the age of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters.
While we as readers know that the threat of the others to the north is difficult to overstate, as the centuries pass by, the memory of the devastation they brought faded with each passing generation. Given the long night was possibly as much as 6,000 to 8,000 years before the main story, and with no noted otherly occurrences since the Night's King during the nascent era of the Wall, it's understandable that Westeros, especially regions outside the north, has largely forgotten about the danger of an icy apocalypse. Yandel says, "Though the Black Brothers of the Watch still guard the realms of men as nobly as they may, the threats they face no longer come from others, wights, giants, greenseers, wargs, skin changers, and other monsters from children's tales and legends, but rather barbaric wildlings armed with stone axes and clubs, savages to be sure, but only men, and no match for disciplined warriors."
And so over the centuries, the Watch has faced a sort of identity crisis. They were formed as guardsmen of civilization, brave warriors who are ready to oppose the others and their horrific army of the dead. But over time, with no new sightings of their foe, the Watch began to lose its purpose, which is the central reason for their decline. As we pointed out, the annals tell us that this decline started long before Aegon's landing, but it certainly continued under the new Targaryen rulers.
Whether the Targaryens accelerated the decline or whether the organization devolved naturally is something we'll explore today, but it's certainly interesting that the Watch continued to dwindle during this era. As we discussed in our last episode, the Targaryens had escaped the volcanic cataclysm of the Doom due to the prophetic visions of Daenys the Dreamer. And then, in the main story, we learn that, quote, Prince Rhaegar found something in his scrolls that changed him. No one knows what it might have been, only that the boy suddenly appeared early one morning in the yard as the knights were donning their steel. He walked up to Sir Willem Darry the Master-at-Arms and said, "I will require sword and armor. It seems I must be a warrior."
What prophetic information Rhaegar found in these scrolls seems related to the prince that was promised prophecy, and so while we speculated that Daenys the Dreamer was also a conduit for that prophecy, we may also wonder if Aegon the Conqueror was aware of the same end-of-days foretellings and what he knew about the others and the Long Night. Given that his family owed their existence to prophecy, and that he and his sisters controlled 3 fire-breathing dragons that might have been anathema to the others, there's a chance he was as interested in these matters as Rhaegar was.
And yet there is no noted correspondence between Aegon and the Night's Watch. You'd think that if Aegon really did believe that a fresh apocalypse would one day arrive in Westeros, he'd have taken a keen interest in the Watch and done what he could to bolster their ranks and emphasize their importance. That the Targaryens would then allow the Watch to continue to diminish, aside from the input of Queen Alysanne, which we'll talk about later, is something of a mystery. But there are 3 factors that might have influenced a disconnect between the Watch and the Targaryens during Aegon's reign and beyond.
Yeah, we know that Aegon and his sisters were aware of the Watch and did take some level of interest, because it was Queen Visenya who, quote, decided the nature of the King's Guard, 7 champions for the Lord of the 7 Kingdoms who would all be knights. and that she modelled their vows upon those of the Night's Watch. And so, why didn't a strong relationship between the Targaryens and the Wall blossom? Well, to begin with, Aegon had a lot on his plate. With the help of his sisters, he had to subdue or win over the lords who opposed his rule of Westeros. Once the trio had displayed their power at the Field of Fire, they had lots of work to do stitching together the Seven Kingdoms under one rule. They had to build a capital city and nurture relationships with lords across the realm, as well as with the religious leaders supporting the interests of the Faith of the Seven. As such, Aegon might have simply been so absorbed by the daunting task ahead of him that he had to put plans for the Watch and the Wall on the back burner.
Yet, even with all these considerations, it's still strange that he's never noted to have visited the Wall, in spite of the North acquiescing to his leadership when Torrhen Stark knelt at the Trident. And a key factor here might have been the identity of the Lord Commander at the time of Aegon's reign. When opposed in the Riverlands by the ruling Ironborn faction led by the tyrannical Harren Hoare, known as Harren the Black, Aegon famously flew his great dragon Balerion to Harren's new seat at Harrenhal and roasted him and his sons within its walls. It was a brutal end for Harren, and news of the scale of the fiery assault where the very walls of the castle were melted into a black, smoldering mess, no doubt spread very quickly throughout Westeros.
And at the far end of the realm were the Night's Watch, led by Harren's brother Lord Commander Hoare. When Maester Aemon tells Jon about his struggles to maintain his own Night's Watch vows, he mentions Lord Commander Hoare as an example, saying, "When Aegon slew Black Harren and claimed his kingdom, Harren's brother was Lord Commander on the Wall, with 10,000 swords to hand. He did not march."
Although Harren's brother did not march, Aegon the Conqueror might not have wanted to test the Lord Commander's resolve by visiting the Wall in person or interfering with the Night's Watch's affairs at that time. From a meta perspective, George has found the perfect reason for Aegon to keep his distance from a place he might have been deeply interested in.
And the final reason that Aegon's descendants, the early generations of Targaryens in Westeros, might have overlooked the Watch is that they were too busy vying for power amongst themselves, as we see in the Sons of the Dragon era and later with the Dance of the Dragons. During such strife, any focus on apocalyptic prophecy might have been lost. The earlier quote about Rhaegar finding something in the scrolls highlights the fact he wasn't taught it as a Targaryen rite of passage, but rather had to go looking for clues himself. If Aegon the Conqueror knew about the prince that was promised, then by the time we get to Rhaegar, a lot had been forgotten, essentially following the theme pertinent to the Night's Watch of the threat of the others being gradually forgotten.
But as we said, the Targaryens hadn't forgotten about the Night's Watch completely. Visenya Targaryen, being inspired by the Watch while designing the institution of the Kingsguard, not only tells us she had a great interest in them, but that she admired their lifestyle to the extent she wanted the Kingsguard, in some ways at least, to emulate them. Just as members of the Night's Watch forfeit all things to guard the realms of men, so would the Kingsguard forfeit all things to guard the king. While Southerners in the current story often speak mockingly or scornfully about the Watch, there's no denying that the organization has left a huge impact on King's Landing and the leadership structure of Westeros. In this light, we might consider the members of the Kingsguard cousins of the Night's Watch Brotherhood.
Yeah, in spite of the visual contrast between the men in white and the men in black, there are plenty of parallels. Two brotherhoods, bound by a strong sense of duty and honour, ready to forfeit their possessions, their love, their chance of fathering children, prepared to put their life on the line for a greater purpose. While these ideals began to fall apart during the decline of the Night's Watch, the Kingsguard has also had its fair share of rot, and so these two disparate institutions really do have a lot in common. In the current story, Jaime Lannister thinks, how is it that the Kingsguard have fallen so low? A question that is often posed about the Watch.
In addition to Visenya, we see the next generation of Targaryens were also well aware of the Men in Black. When Aenys succeeded Aegon as king of Westeros, there was a stirring of discontentment amidst the faith, who frowned upon some of the Valyrian customs. In particular, they opposed the marriage between Aenys' son Aegon and his daughter Rhaena on the grounds that incest was not accepted in the faith of the Seven. While the Targaryens could point to the example of the Conqueror and his sister wives, on this issue there would soon be more trouble.
Yet Aenys' brother Maegor was less diplomatic than Aenys, and after his first marriage to Cerys Hightower proved barren, he took a second wife in secret, marrying Alice Harroway in a Valyrian ceremony. Offended by polygamy, the faith led the public outcry against Maegor, and wanting to restore peace, Aenys exiled his brother. But when Maegor eventually succeeded Aenys, he was less intimidated by the faith. Maester Yandel says, "Chief among Maegor's foes were the faith militant, the orders of the warriors' sons and the poor fellows, and with his war against them provided a constant backdrop to his reign. In King's Landing, the militant orders had seized hold of the Sept of Remembrance and the half-built Red Keep, but Maegor flew straight into the city, fearless upon Balerion, and raised the Red Dragon of House Targaryen on Visenya's hill to rally men to him. Thousands joined him."
Maegor's bloody struggle against the faith militant continued, and now we arrive at the significance of the Watch during Maegor's reign. After overcoming the warriors' sons in Oldtown, the king gave the captured knights a choice. Archmaester Gyldayn tells us in Fire and Blood, those who renounced their allegiance to the order would be permitted to travel to the Wall and live out their days as brothers of the Night's Watch. Those who refused could die as martyrs to their faith. 3/4 of the captives chose to take the black. The remainder died.
Even so, the war was not done. The Poor Fellows' leader, Poxy Jane Poor, eluded the king. In Fire and Blood, we learn the king's forces hunted down scores of Poor Fellows who had taken refuge in the Great Wood south of the Blackwater, sending many to the Wall and hanging those who refused to take the black.
And so we can see that during Maegor's reign, the Night's Watch became part of his political scheme to neutralize his opponents. Sending dissenters to the Wall was a way of removing them from the chessboard without actually killing them. At the same time, he was greatly increasing the numbers of the Night's Watch, which they must have been thankful for, maintaining their renown as a sizable force. However, by sending large groups of shamed men who were considered outlaws to take the black, Maegor might have diminished the reputation of the Watch as a place of high honor. Certainly, increasing the ratio of rebels and criminals effectively forced into taking the black versus those who chose to join for noble causes affected the public's perception of the organization, especially in the South. The Wall became a punitive destination rather than an aspirational one.
And there was more royalty-inspired dishonour at the Wall during the reign of Jaehaerys I. When the realm could no longer tolerate the tyrannical authority of King Maegor, Prince Jaehaerys' claim to the throne gained support. The World Book tells us even 2 of the Kingsguard abandoned Maegor, joining Jaehaerys instead. Fire and Blood goes a step further and names the 2 rebel Kingsguard, Sir Oliver Bracken and Sir Raymond Mallory. It says, the pair had played a part in the late king's downfall by turning their cloaks and going over to Jaehaerys, but the boy king observed rightly that in doing so they had broken their vows to defend the king's life with their own. "I will have no oath breakers at my court," he proclaimed. All 5 remaining Kingsguard were therefore sentenced to death, but at the urging of Princess Alysanne, it was agreed that they might be spared if they would exchange their white cloaks for black by joining the Night's Watch. 4 of the 5 accepted this clemency and departed for the Wall.
But the tale doesn't end there. With the ranks of the Watch now filled with discontented former faith militant, including a new contingent who had accepted clemency from the boy king, trouble was brewing. In 50 AC, the dissent boiled over, and the new faith militant at the Wall rebelled at Rhymegate and Sable Hall, 2 Night's Watch castles in close proximity to each other. And who was leading these rebels? Why, none other than Oliver Bracken and Raymond Mallory, the two Kingsguard who had broken their oaths to Maegor. In Fire and Blood, we get this. The Lord Commander of the Watch unwisely had given Bracken and Mallory command of two crumbling forts in order to restore them. Instead, the two men decided to make the castles their own seats and establish themselves as lords.
Their rules did not last for long, though, as only 1 man in 10 at the wall joined the rebellion, with the rest honouring their vows. And of course the rebellion awoke the strength of Winterfell, with Lord Walton Stark soon joining his host to the true men of the Watch and attacking Rhymegate. While almost all the rebels were hanged for breaking their oaths, Lord Stark reserved true northern justice for their leader, beheading Oliver Bracken with the famed blade Ice, showing us what Ned Stark had to live up to in the first chapter of A Game of Thrones.
Word of Rhymegate's defeat reached Sable Hall. Expecting to be soundly defeated by their brothers and the Starks, the rebels fled north of the Wall to freedom. Lord Walton wanted to bring them to justice, so he pursued them. 2 days later, in the haunted forest, he and his men encountered a band of giants. In spite of Lord Walton apparently slaying 2 of the giants, he was, quote, dragged from his saddle and torn apart. Then, according to Fire and Blood, the remaining pieces of Lord Walton's body were carried to Castle Black by his men.
But the deserters didn't fare much better north of the Wall. Gildane tells us, as for Raymond Mallory and the other deserters, the wildlings gave them a cold welcome. Rebels or no, the free folk had no use for crows. Sir Raymond's head was delivered to Eastwatch half a year later. When asked what had befallen the rest of his men, the wildling chieftain laughed and said, "We ate them."
And on that grim note, we can see there are 2 cautionary tales here about the Night's Watch. First, there is a tipping point when you place too many dishonorable recruits together at the Wall. Second, we can see that betraying the Watch ends in big trouble for rebels and deserters who really have nowhere to run. Both of these lessons are pertinent to the main story, especially when Chet and his gang of mutineers plan to create carnage at the Fist of the First Men and flee their black brothers, a plan which leads to the murder of Lord Commander Jeor Mormont at Craster's Keep.
But there were those Targaryen monarchs who viewed the Night's Watch as more than just a dumping ground for rebels and oathbreakers. In A Storm of Swords, Jon Snow finds himself with a contingent of free folk near Queen's Crown in the New Gift. More on that momentarily. Among the group is Ygritte, and Jon fills her in as to why the top of the tower is painted yellow. He says, "A queen stayed there for a night, Alysanne, the wife of King Jaehaerys the Conciliator. He's called the Old King because he reigned so long, but he was young when he first came to the Iron Throne. In those days, it was his wont to travel all over the realm. When he came to Winterfell, he brought his queen, 6 dragons, and half his court. The king had matters to discuss with his warden of the north, and Alysanne grew bored, so she mounted her dragon, Silverwing, and flew north to see the Wall. This village was one of the places where she stopped. Afterward, the small folk painted the top of their holdfast to look like the golden crown she'd worn when she spent the night among them."
And in Fire and Blood, we get more details about Alysanne's trip to the Wall. Flying north on her dragon Silverwing, the sight of the Wall, quote, took Alysanne's breath away, remembering it's considered one of the wonders of the world. But with many of the Night's Watch being former Faith militant, there was concern as to how she would be received at Castle Black. Aware of those dynamics, Lord Alaric Stark warned Lord Commander Lothar Burleigh, who then sent 800 men to meet her, and we can guess that none of these were Faith militant devotees. The chefs at Castle Black prepared a feast to welcome the Queen of mammoth meat, mead, and stout. While mammoth meat sounds intriguing and the dinner was considered lavish by the standards of the Wall, Lord Commander Burleigh was sensitive to the fact that Targaryen royalty was used to finer dining. However, endearing herself to the Watch from the outset, Alysanne proved to be quite humble and told Burleigh that the food was nourishing, and that is all I require. It will please me to eat as you do.
So in spite of being a woman and a queen, Alysanne tried to blend in at Castle Black, seeing the world as the Night's Watch did, and refusing to let either the food or the basic living conditions affect her. She was known as a champion of the small folk, and here at the Wall she was cultivating a similar reputation. And not only surprised by the Queen's unpretentious conduct, the men of the Watch were also, quote, thunderstruck by the Queen's dragon. For those that had never seen a dragon before, watching their queen mount one and then go flying around the Wall must have been quite a sight, giving Alysanne further admirers.
But it should also be noted that Alysanne reported some strange behavior from Silverwing above the Wall. We get this intriguing passage from Fire and Blood. Though it was summer and the Wall was weeping, the chill of the ice could still be felt whenever the wind blew, and every gust would make the dragon hiss and snap. Thrice I flew Silverwing high above Castle Black, and thrice I tried to take her north beyond the Wall, Alysanne wrote to Jaehaerys. But every time she veered back south again and refused to go. Never before has she refused to take me where I wished to go. I laughed about it when I came down again, so the Black Brothers would not realize anything was amiss, but it troubled me then, and it troubles me still.
So the reader is left to wonder if it was simply the cold winds that deterred Silverwing, or something magical. Not only is the Wall a formidable physical barrier of stone and ice, but there are apparently ancient spells woven into it too. Maybe the dragon was sensing such warding magic and was affected by its power. This is an interesting aspect to Castle Black's backstory, because one day, when Daenerys has finally landed in Westeros, she might take her dragons north and attempt to fly beyond the Wall. In such a scenario, would her dragons behave as defiantly as Silverwing? That's the million-dollar question.
True. And while Alysanne showed the men of the Watch their first dragon, they showed her her first free folk. Having captured a raiding party attempting to scale the Wall, the Watch displayed them in cages for Alysanne to see. Here we learn of a grim tradition in the Watch, as the Black Brothers explained what would be done to the captives. Alysanne was told they would have their ears cut off before being released north of the Wall. But those who already had no ears, meaning they'd been caught for a second time, were beheaded. Taking the ears of invading free folk was a way of identifying offenders and providing a deterrent to those who were caught.
And bonding with the men over, quote, ballads, war songs and bawdy barrack tunes, Alysanne felt trusting enough of the Watch to venture north of the Wall, although she did have 100 rangers to protect her. Clearly impressed by the organisation, the Queen then desired to visit more of the Night's Watch's castles. Lord Commander Burleigh agreed to the request and sent First Ranger Benton Glover with her across the top of the Wall all the way to the Night Fort. Alysanne thought the journey was beautiful, but was less impressed by the Night Fort itself, later telling Jaehaerys, "It is so huge the men seem dwarfed by it, like mice in a ruined hall, and there is a darkness there, a taste in the air. I was so glad to leave that place."
As a keen listener representing the Targaryen throne, Alysanne considered the needs of the Watch deeply. Given the cost and difficulties in maintaining the massive Night Fort, she agreed that a new, smaller castle was needed in its place. She told Lord Commander Burleigh to abandon the Night Fort and build a new castle to the east. When Burleigh balked at the cost of such a project, Alysanne agreed to pay for it herself. "I have a good many jewels," she said.
Bran tells us in A Storm of Swords that Deep Lake had been paid for by the Queen's jewels and built by the men the old king had sent north, and the Black Brothers had abandoned the Night Fort to the rats. Taking 8 years to build, Deep Lake was finally completed and a statue of Alysanne placed outside its main hall, which still stands to this day. As a further honour to the Queen who had come to the Wall and listened to the Night's Watch, Burleigh renamed another Night's Watch castle, Snowgate, Queensgate.
But Alysanne didn't stop there. So impressed was she with the Black Brothers at the fringes of civilization that she wanted them to have more land. Bran Stark recounts the information he learned from Maester Luwin. Brandon the Builder gave all the land south of the wall to the Black brothers to a distance of 25 leagues for their sustenance and support. Thousands of years later, good Queen Alysanne visited the wall on her dragon Silverwing, and she thought the Night's Watch was so brave that she had the old king double the size of their lands to 50 leagues, so that is the new gift.
The Starks were apparently less than happy that their lands had been granted to the Black brothers, and Yandel tells us, letters from Lord Stark's brother to the Citadel, asking the maesters to provide precedence against the forced donation of property, made it plain that the Starks were not eager to do as King Jaehaerys bid. It may be that the Starks feared that, under the control of Castle Black, the new gift would inevitably decline, for the Night's Watch would always look northward and never give much thought to their new tenants to the south.
But clearly, at least some of the residents of the region took their reallocation in stride, evidenced by the holdfast at Queen's Crown being rechristened in Alysanne's honor. And the Watch themselves were grateful to receive the extra territory to help support themselves. Good Queen Aly left an indelible mark on the Night's Watch, and when we talk about the decline of the organization, we can see that it clearly didn't occur in a straight line. Even after the rebellion of the Faith Militant at the Wall, the Watch was still a well-stocked organization that commanded respect. By experiencing life at the Wall firsthand and responding to the Watch's needs, Alysanne's support gained her the undying respect of the Men in Black. We're left to wonder if there were any conversations between Burleigh and the Queen concerning the threats of the others and the history of the Long Night, and if such discussion fed into Alysanne's desire to reinforce the Watch.
And following the reign of Jaehaerys I and Alysanne, we come to the fateful Dance of the Dragons era. Late in the reign of the old king, the Lord of Winterfell was Ellared Stark, who supported Princess Rhaenys at the Council of 101. And there's a passage in the World Book that suggests Ellard's voting was influenced by Jaehaerys' decision to donate northern lands to the Night's Watch, though with no elaboration on how he thought a vote for Rhaenys or Laenor would affect the situation. We're left to wonder if this is gossipy speculation or there had been agreements made between House Stark and House Velaryon.
Later, during Rhaenyra's ascension as head of the faction known as the Blacks, her stalwart ally Corlys Velaryon suggested sending members of the Green faction to Castle Black. The passage goes, "What of this false king Aegon and the kinslayer Aemond? Would you have me pardon them as well, those who stole my throne and slew my sons?" "Spare them and send them to the Wall," Lord Corlys answered. "Let them live out their lives as men of the Night's Watch bound by sacred vows." "What are vows to oath-breakers?" Queen Rhaenyra demanded. "Their vows did not trouble them when they took my throne."
And really, both Rhaenyra and Corlys were making good points. In a fractious situation that had divided the realm, the Blacks showing mercy and sending their foe to the Wall might have had better optics than executing them. However, Rhaenyra, who was no doubt educated on the misdeeds of disgraced Kingsguard turned Night's Watch deserters Raymond Mallory and Oliver Bracken, rightfully points out that oaths can easily be broken, and so we're left to reflect on the importance and fragile nature of oaths and vows in a world full of dishonour.
And Corlys almost got a taste of his own medicine toward the end of the dance after switching allegiances and aiding the Greens. During the Hour of the Wolf, when Lord Cregan Stark presided over King's Landing for 6 days, Corlys was arrested by the Northmen along with 21 other Greens for the crime of regicide related to Aegon II's death. Cregan offered the accused the chance to take the Black, and 19 men agreed and were promptly sent north. The 2 men who refused to take the Black, Larys Strong and Kingsguard Sir Giles Belgrave, were executed by Cregan himself with the greatsword Ice. Fortunately for Lord Corlys, Baela and Rhaena Targaryen pleaded for their grandfather's life, and Lady Alysanne Blackwood also took up the case, offering herself as a wife to Cregan Stark to seal the deal.
Ultimately, the Dance of the Dragons devastated the realm, and perhaps it's no coincidence that the years that followed were tough for the Night's Watch. With Lord Cregan distracted by affairs in the south and a freezing winter at hand, there was a perfect storm of problems developing at the wall. No doubt emboldened in the aftermath of the Civil War, the Free Folk launched a series of attacks as food stocks reached dangerously low levels in the north when winter set in.
As widespread famine swept the north, compounded by an outbreak of a contagion called winter fever, the Free Folk continued to attack the wall. Gildane says, a raider named Silas the Grim led 3,000 wildlings against the wall, overwhelming the Black Brothers at Queen's Gate and spreading out across the Gift until Lord Cregan Stark rode forth from Winterfell, joined with the Glovers of Deepwood Motte, the Flints and Norries of the Hills, and 100 rangers from the Night's Watch, to hunt them down and put an end to them.
Despite this eventual victory, the Watchers' problems were only beginning. The cold weather and famine combined to devastate them, and a third of their men were lost to the extreme conditions. And with the shivering sea freezing over to the north, the Free Folk had a new pathway around the wall and attacked in great numbers, killing hundreds more of the Watch.
Altogether, the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons was terrible for the realm, and the fact that it affected the wall thousands of miles from the action in King's Landing tells us how pervasive the problems were. While Alysanne might have done everything she could to strengthen the Watch, a few decades later the organization was on its knees, perhaps losing over half their men in total. In the discussion of the Night's Watch arc of decline, the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons in the 2nd century is a significant era.
And so we approached the latter days of the Targaryen reign. A century after the Dance of the Dragons, the Lord Commander was one Jack Musgood. He was infamous for arriving late to a battle between King Beyond the Wall Raymond Redbeard's host of Free Folk and a Stark and Umber contingent. Having scaled the wall unnoticed and then thrown ropes and ladders down for thousands more to climb, Raymond Redbeard was confronted by the Northerners at Long Lake almost before the Watch even knew he had crossed the wall at all. In A Dance with Dragons, Jon Snow thinks Jolly Jack, he was called before Redbeard came down upon the north, Sleepy Jack forever after.
And the result was a tragedy for House Stark, as the Lord of Winterfell, Willem Stark, was slaughtered. Willem's brother Artos gained revenge by slaying Raymond, and with the help of the drunken giant Harmond Umber, no thanks to Sleepy Jack and the men of the Watch. According to the World Book, Artos Stark, quote, gave the Black Brothers the duty of burying the dead. This task, at the least, they performed admirably.
6 years after the incursion by Raymond Redbeard in 233 AC, Brynden Rivers aka Bloodraven took the Black. Some years previously, after capturing his rebellious half-brother Aegor Rivers aka Bittersteel, following the Third Blackfire Rebellion of 219 AC, then Hand of the King Lord Bloodraven had tried to send him to the wall to neutralise any further rebellions. However, Aegor was freed by men of the Golden Company who managed to ambush the ship that was carrying him to Eastwatch, and Bittersteel fled to Essos, where he continued plotting to place a Blackfire on the throne of Westeros.
And some years later, upon the death of King Maekar I, wary of more Blackfire-related devastation, Bloodraven cunningly invited Daemon Blackfire's 5th son, Aenys, to King's Landing to participate in the Great Council that would select the new king. Surely the 5th son of a technically legitimized son of Aegon IV must have felt that he had a better claim to the throne than the 4th son of the 4th son of a man Aenys' family believed, admittedly with some mental gymnastics, to be illegitimate. And so it was probably with more hope than wisdom that Aenys Blackfire decided to attend the council to present his claim. Yandel sums up what happened next. Hardly had he entered the city when the Goldcloaks seized hold of him and dragged him to the Red Keep, where his head was struck off forthwith and presented to the lords of the Great Council as a warning to any who might still have Blackfire sympathies.
The Great Council chose Aegon V, aka Egg, as their king, and the first major decision he was confronted with was to decide Bloodraven's fate. It says, though many agreed and were pleased to see another Blackfire pretender removed, King Aegon felt he had no choice but to condemn the hand, lest the word of the Iron Throne be seen as worthless. Bloodraven himself admitted his guilt, quote, contending that he had sacrificed his own personal honour for the good of the realm.
But Aegon gave Bloodraven the choice of death or the wall. Lord Rivers made the fateful choice to live and set sail for Eastwatch, joined by 200 of his loyal men, many of whom were skilled archers of his personal guard, known as the Raven's Teeth. But Bloodraven wasn't the only man with royal blood on that ship, for the new king's elder brother, Maester Aemon, who we'll get to momentarily, was also among them.
Being such a prominent figure in the realm and with an entourage of 200, perhaps it should not be surprising that Bloodraven climbed the ranks quickly at the Wall. Within 6 years he had ascended to the position of Lord Commander. However, after serving as Lord Commander for 13 years, Lord Rivers disappeared on a ranging expedition north of the Wall in 252 AC.
And of course, readers of the main series discovered what had happened to Brynden Rivers with the release of A Dance with Dragons. When Bran Stark finally meets the three-eyed crow who'd summoned him and his companions to a remote cave north of the Wall, we get this description. Before them, a pale lord in ebon finery sat dreaming in a tangled nest of roots, a woven weirwood throne that embraced his withered limbs as a mother does a child. His body was so skeletal and his clothes so rotted that at first Bran took him for another corpse, a dead man propped up so long that the roots had grown over him, under him, and through him. What skin the corpse lord showed was white, save for a bloody blotch that crept up his neck onto his cheek. His white hair was fine and thin as root hair and long enough to brush against the earthen floor. Roots coiled around his legs like wooden serpents. One burrowed through his breeches into the desiccated flesh of his thigh to emerge again from his shoulder. A spray of dark red leaves sprouted from his skull, and gray mushrooms spotted his brow. A little skin remained, stretched across his face, tight and hard as white leather, but even that was fraying, and here and there the brown and yellow bone was poking through.
Later, when Bran's companion Mira asks his name, the three-eyed crow replied, I wore many names when I was quick, but even I once had a mother, and the name she gave me at her breast was Brynden. And so we learn that, sustained beyond his natural lifespan by physically joining to weirwood roots, tended to by the children of the forest, Lord Bloodraven had become the last greenseer since his disappearance from the Wall. Greenseeing is an ancient form of weirwood magic that gives glimpses of past, present, and even future. And check out our Children of the Forest / Greenseer episode if you want a detailed analysis of this intriguing supernatural ability. For now, we'll keep it brief by saying that Bloodraven had mastered the art of greenseeing and chose Bran Stark to be his protege.
What exactly happened for Bloodraven to end up in that cave remains a mystery, but via future Dunk and Egg stories and Bran chapters in The Winds of Winter and beyond, we hope to one day get the whole picture. As for his current motivation, notice that he's still dressed in his black finery, suggesting that, while absent for nearly 50 years, he still considers himself a man of the watch. He seems to have control over Cold Hands, who, with the help of a flock of ravens, helped rescue Night's Watchman Sam Tarly from a white attack, and then led Bran and his companions to the cave. His mentoring of Bran is surely leading to some dramatic endgame involving defying the upcoming Others attack, so there's good reason to believe Bloodraven is sticking to his vows, keeping watch.
And part of the function of Bloodraven is to create a through line from the Dunk and Egg era to the modern story. But he's not the only character George is employing for that purpose. Arriving at the Wall with Bloodraven was his great-nephew, Maester Aemon. While we've seen several examples of characters being sent to the Wall to nullify their political threat, Aemon sent himself there to avoid being thrust into a situation where he could be used politically against his younger brother Egg.
Having been sent to the Citadel by his grandfather, King Daeron II, Aemon was used to life in a Brotherhood-type institution. And after he was, quote, quietly offered the throne by the same council that ultimately chose his younger brother, Aemon made the decision to remove himself from political machinations and become a Maester of the Watch, tending to the ravens and acting as a physician at Castle Black. As Maester, he was a keen reader, and as a Targaryen, he was interested in prophecy, leading him ultimately into a long-distance correspondence with his own great-great-nephew Rhaegar about the prince that was promised. This no doubt fed Rhaegar's penchant for prophecy and might have contributed, however indirectly, to Robert's rebellion. It's interesting to think that Aemon, himself reluctant to be involved in politics, had a major effect on 3 generations of Targaryens, Egg, Rhaegar, and in the current story, Jon Snow, all of whom are deeply political characters.
Aemon served the Night's Watch faithfully in spite of the 3 temptations he alludes to Jon Snow. Thinking of the long span of his life, all the regrets and inner conflicts he must have harboured relating to the downfall of his house adds extra layers of sadness to one of the most tear-jerking lines of A Song of Ice and Fire. Egg, I dreamed that I was old, spoken shortly before his death at sea en route to Old Town. Upon his death, Aemon had served a dozen Lord Commanders at the Wall, and we know 4 or 5 of them, possibly Jack Musgood, depending on how long his tenure lasted, but certainly Brynden Rivers, Corgyle, Mormont, and Jon Snow.
And another character of the Night's Watch we've met that goes back to the Targaryen era is Sir Denys Mallister. We learn in A Storm of Swords that Sir Denys, commander of the Shadow Tower, had put himself forward to be considered as Lord Commander twice previously, only to be beaten by Jeor Mormont and before that by Lord Commander Corgyle. And speaking of Corgyle, he's an interesting and pertinent Lord Commander because he was in charge at the end of the Targaryen reign. We might wonder what a noble Dornishman was doing at the northern extremity of the realm and how he came to be leader of the Watch, but sadly there is very limited information about him. Apart from the detail that late in his tenure he traveled to Winterfell with Mance Rayder to meet Ned Stark, all we can really say about him with surety is that he served the Watch for more than 20 years and was the 996th Lord Commander, dying in 288 AC and being succeeded by Jeor Mormont.
And so we're left to wonder what life at the Wall was like under Lord Commander Corgyle during the reign of the Mad King as Robert Baratheon's rebellion brought about the ruin of House Targaryen, changing the course of the 7 kingdoms forever. And in the next segment, we'll consider the Night's Watch during the rebellion and the Baratheon era.
And now we want to take a moment to thank our patrons from the Valyrian Steel level. Thanks so much to Aileen, Arshia, Oxheart, Blight Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Cabeth the Unfrozen, David, Dean, James K, Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Jill, JM, Herbert Westeros, the Miskatonic Maester, Casey, Lady Silverwing, Infandaris, the Unspeakable Terror, Mark, Boss, Schwartz the Black, the Sithorian, Sally, Tristis Lorien, Wild Child of the Wolfswood, Tim, Magnar of Hoostan, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castleknocky, the Alpha Patron.
The Night's Watch has become an army of sullen boys and tired old men. Apart from the men at my table tonight, I have perhaps 20 who can read, and even fewer who can think, or plan, or lead. Once the Watch spent its summers building, and each Lord Commander raised the wall higher than he found it. Now it is all we can do to stay alive.
In 281 AC, Robert Baratheon began his successful rebellion against the crown. Of course, the Night's Watch takes no part in the Wars of the Seven Kingdoms, and so it was business as usual for Castle Black. But it's interesting to wonder how word of the rebellion affected the mindset of the Watch, because given the scale of the rebellion, many of the recruits no doubt had friends and family involved.
Yet consider the case of Maester Aemon. As we've covered, he came to the Wall hoping to escape politics in King's Landing, refusing any chance to rule from the Iron Throne. When he reveals his identity to Jon Snow, he mentions the 3 tests to his vows, including one during the rebellion. He says, "My ravens would bring the news from the south, words darker than their wings, the ruin of my house, the death of my kin, disgrace and desolation. What could I have done, old, blind, frail? I was helpless as a suckling babe, yet still it grieved me to sit forgotten as they cut down my brother's poor grandson, and his son, and even the little children."
And so Aemon had to focus on his Night's Watch duties as his family were being routed, with Robert Baratheon not about to show mercy to the dragon spawn of House Targaryen. There were doubtless others among Aemon's black brothers who felt conflicted about ignoring what was unfolding in the south, including Lord Commander Corgyle, who as a Dornishman would have fought for the crown had he not joined the Watch, and like Aemon must have been shocked and repulsed to hear of the assault on Ilia Martell and the murder of her royal children.
And after the sack of King's Landing, when Robert's victory was assured, there was the usual round of forcing dissenters and foes to choose between execution and taking the Black. We know 2 men of the Watch from the current story who took that route to the Wall. When Tyrion Lannister visits Castle Black, we get this passage. "The Watch has no shortage of stable boys," Lord Mormont grumbled. "That seems to be all they send us these days, stable boys and sneak thieves and rapers. Sir Alliser is an anointed knight, one of the few to take the Black since I have been Lord Commander. He fought bravely at King's Landing." "On the wrong side," Sir Jeremy Riker commented dryly. "I ought to know. I was there on the battlements beside him. Tywin Lannister gave us a splendid choice. Take the Black or see our heads on spikes before evenfall."
Unfortunately, Jeremy Riker doesn't last long in the main story. When former Night's Watch Rangers Othar and Jafer Flowers, now Whites, attack Castle Black, the brave Sir Jeremy was one of 5 people killed by un-Jafer. After saving Lord Commander Mormont from Othar's Revenant, Jon Snow reflects, the other White, the one-handed thing that had once been a ranger named Jafer Flowers, had also been destroyed, cut near to pieces by a 12 swords, but not before it had slain Sir Jeremy Riker and 4 other men. Sir Jeremy had finished the job of hacking its head off, yet had died all the same when the headless corpse pulled his own dagger from its sheath and buried it in his bowels.
But Sir Alliser Thorne lives on, the hardened master-at-arms overseeing the training yard. Tyrion Lannister thinks he walks like a man with a dagger up his butt, so clearly they didn't hit it off, and Thorne is feared by new recruits as a merciless, bitter figure who veers into bullying in the training sessions we see in Jon chapters. His consistently poor treatment of Jon, perhaps owing to the fact that the new recruit is from the Stark family that opposed the Targaryens in the rebellion, is ironic in light of the fact that Jon is likely the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, and perhaps even a legitimate king. If only the Targaryen loyalist Thorne knew who he was dressing down in the training yard. With the audience suspecting something the characters don't realise, this is a prime example of dramatic irony.
As for the state of the Watch following Robert's rebellion, it seems that the new ruler only hastened its decline. King Robert is portrayed as a better soldier than leader who quickly became bored in his reign. After Greyjoy's rebellion in 289, Robert seems to have grown tired of ruling and is noted by Queen Cersei to have either slept through his small council meetings or not attended at all. He effectively delegated his duties to others, and with no northern representation in King's Landing, the Night's Watch were out of sight, out of mind, and not a priority.
There's also the fact that, unlike the Targaryens, Robert is not known to have been interested in history or prophecies, and so any lingering fear within the Red Keep about the ancient White Walkers was lost during his reign. Had Rhaegar, who was knee-deep in apocalyptic prophecy, beaten Robert on the Trident, then he might have placed a great emphasis on the Watch and rejuvenating the organisation, remembering his communications with Maester Aemon.
But under Robert, the watch dwindled, and although their decline had been gradual over thousands of years, at the beginning of the main story they were in a sorry state, something communicated clearly by the author from a number of different sources. As early as the first Catelyn chapter in A Game of Thrones, Ned tells his wife, "Ben writes that the strength of the Night's Watch is down below 1,000. It's not only desertions, they're losing men on rangings as well." And soon after arriving at Castle Black, Jon Snow thinks, once Castle Black had housed 5,000 fighting men with all their horses and servants and weapons. Now it was home to 1/10 that number, and parts of it were falling into ruin.
But it's Tyrion who delivers the harshest and most frank assessment of the decline of the Night's Watch in this passage with Jon. "No doubt the Starks have been terribly good to you. I am certain Lady Stark treats you as if you were one of her own. And your brother Robb, he's always been kind, and why not? He gets Winterfell and you get the Wall. And your father, he must have good reasons for packing you off to the Night's Watch." "Stop it," Jon said, his face dark with anger. "The Night's Watch is a noble calling." Tyrion laughed. "You're too smart to believe that. The Night's Watch is a midden heap for all the misfits of the realm. I've seen you looking at Euron and his boys. Those are your new brothers, Jon Snow. How do you like them? Sullen peasants, debtors, poachers, rapers, thieves and bastards like you all wind up on the Wall, watching for grumpkins and snarks and all the other monsters your wet nurse warned you about. The good part is there are no grumpkins or snarks, so it's scarcely dangerous work. The bad part is you freeze your balls off, but since you're not allowed to breed anyway, I don't suppose that matters."
And so this southerner's impression of the Watch is as a half-prison, half-reject bin for the dregs of Westeros, guarding the wall for no particular purpose. However, not only is the reader painfully aware that the others have returned, another example of dramatic irony, but we also soon get to experience life at Castle Black through Jon's point of view. While there are clearly lots of problems with the Night's Watch, there are in fact many positives, including the characters who are loyal, fierce, and devoted in equal measure, and chief among them is Lord Commander Jeor Mormont.
Jeor was elected leader of the Watch in 288 following the death of Lord Commander Corgyle. As a high-born man of the North, the former Lord of Bear Island, he no doubt shared the historic view of the Watch that Jon Snow had bought into, that serving the realm was a noble calling. With no indication that Jeor had done anything wrong, it seems that maybe he abdicated his seat in the belief his son Jorah would be a worthy successor to Bear Island, perhaps after his unnamed wife passed away and with the intent of elevating Jorah's status. And so, while we can't say exactly when Jeor joined the Watch, it is noted that he rose through the ranks quickly and was 58 when he was chosen as leader. Meanwhile, Jorah showed promise as a Northern Lord, leading the charge at the Siege of Pike, but later disgraced himself, turning to poaching in the attempt to meet the financial requirements of his demanding Southern wife's lifestyle. If Jeor really did join the Watch to pave the way for his son at Bear Island, the business with Lyness Hightower, which ended in Jorah being exiled by Ned Stark, must have been a bitter pill to swallow.
But there's little evidence that watching helplessly from the wall as his son disgraced himself adversely affected Jeor's duty to the Watch, in spite of his disgruntled, bear-like appearance. When Jon first meets him, he thinks, Jeor Mormont, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, was a gruff old man with an immense bald head and a shaggy grey beard. He had a raven on his arm, and he was feeding it kernels of corn. And then when Tyrion meets him, he thinks, old as he was, the Lord Commander still had the strength of a bear.
68 years old at the beginning of the story, Jeor is soon revealed to be a competent and serious leader of the Watch. When Waymar Royce doesn't return, he sends First Ranger Benjen Stark north of the Wall to investigate. His companions, Othor and Jafer, eventually return to Castle Black as undead wights, leaving Benjen's fate a mystery. This incident tells us that Jeor was worried about what was going on up north and was ready to act, although he does concede his error in allowing the green Waymar Royce to lead a ranging on account of his highborn status.
And after the incident with the two whites, who were clearly targeting the Lord Commander in his tower, Jorah didn't shy away from reacting, even if it meant great discomfort to himself. Toward the end of A Game of Thrones, he begins to plan a great ranging to find Benjen, telling Jon, "I will not sit here meekly and wait for the snows and the ice winds. We must know what is happening. This time the Night's Watch will ride in force against the King beyond the wall, the others, and anything else that may be out there. I mean to command them myself."
And in A Storm of Swords, Jorah indicates why he made the fateful decision to lead the Night's Watch north in force, saying, "The Night's Watch has forgotten its true purpose, Tarly. You don't build a wall 700 feet high to keep savages and skins from stealing women. The wall was made to guard the realms of men, and not against other men, which is all the wildlings are when you come right down to it. Too many years, Tarly, too many hundreds and thousands of years. We lost sight of the true enemy. And now he's here, but we don't know how to fight him."
While we get to a character rundown of the Watch later, it's interesting to consider how the organization functioned during the Baratheon era before the threat of the others became apparent. Given the Watch's focus was the relatively tame threat posed by occasional incursions of free folk, especially before Mance Rayder became king beyond the wall, we actually learn quite a bit during the Great Ranging about how the Watch functioned in regard to the free folk.
One man north of the wall who seems essential to the Watch's operations is a character called Craster. He lives in a so-called keep within the haunted forest and is considered a friend to the Watch. As an ally, he occasionally allows rangers to sleep and eat at his home, and the fact that we see Lord Commander Mormont offer him an axe tells us that the Watch makes it worth his while with such gifts that might be difficult to come by north of the wall, especially if he doesn't want to interact with other free folk.
Yeah, Craster is of the free folk himself, yet seems to dislike his fellows and lives in isolation from any rule of law. We get some of his backstory in A Storm of Swords when Ygritte of the free folk tells Jon Snow, "Craster's more your kind than ours. His father was a crow who stole a woman out of White Tree Village, but after he had her, he flew back to his wall. She went to Castle Black once to show the crow his son, but the brothers blew their horns and run her off. Craster's blood is black, and he bears a heavy curse."
Things are rarely black and white in A Song of Ice and Fire, and here George presents us with a character who bridges the Night's Watch and the Free Folk. His black blood makes him accepting of the Watch, yet he's still a very difficult ally. Living outside of society and refusing to integrate with the Free Folk, Craster lives his life the way he wants. Unfortunately, that includes marrying his own daughters and offering his sons to the others, aka the Cold Gods. The fact that the Watch calls him a friend is testament to how desperate they are to cultivate relationships with potential allies north of the wall.
And from his perspective, as with sacrificing his sons to the others, Craster might consider himself a survivalist who will do anything to be left to his own devices beyond the conventions of civilization. So the Watch hold their noses and take advantage of his hospitality. Commanding the Rangers on the expedition up north, Thorin Smallwood tells Jor, "The man's half mad, I won't deny it, but you'd be the same if you'd spent your life in this cursed wood. Even so, he's never turned a ranger away from his fire, nor does he love Mance Rayder. He'll give us good counsel."
Another known friend to the Watch beyond the wall was Hagen, the skin changer who mentored Varamir Sixskins. In the A Dance with Dragons prologue, we not only learn about the Free Folks dealing at Eastwatch, but Hagen's relationship with the Black Brothers. Varamir thinks, "It was he who showed me Eastwatch." Hagen traded a dozen strings of amber and a sled piled high with pelts for 6 skins of wine, a block of salt, and a copper kettle. Eastwatch was a better place to trade than Castle Black. That was where the ships came, laden with goods from the fabled lands beyond the sea. The crows knew Hagen as a hunter and a friend to the Watch, and welcomed the news he brought of life beyond their wall. Some knew him for a skin changer too, but no one spoke of that.
So we see the relationship between the Night's Watch and the Free Folk is more complex than originally presented. Rather than two factions of enemies locked in eternal opposition, as we've said, there's a grayness in between that benefits both parties. And while Craster was part of that gray area, there's another, more prominent character with a mix of Free Folk and Night's Watchmen in him who's less sympathetic to the Black Brothers, the King Beyond the Wall, Mance Rayder.
Yeah, we've heard about Craster having a Night's Watchman as a father and a Free Folk mother, and it's the same with Mance Rayder. But whereas the Black Brothers refused to take Craster in, possibly because he was demonstrably not an orphan, we learn from a Jon POV in A Clash of Kings that the Watch took Mance in as a child when they killed all the adults in a raiding party he was part of. And so Mance grew up at the Wall and eventually became a ranger stationed at the Shadow Tower.
And toward the end of Lord Commander Corgyle's tenure, he took Mance to Winterfell. The King Beyond the Wall tells Jon, "You were just a boy, and I was all in black, one of a dozen riding escort to old Lord Commander Corgyle when he came down to see your father at Winterfell. I was walking the wall around the yard when I came on you and your brother Robb. It had snowed the night before, and the two of you had built a great mountain above the gate and were waiting for someone likely to pass underneath."
So there we have an interesting situation. A Lord of Winterfell in Ned Stark, a Lord Commander of the Watch in Corgyle, a Night's Watchman stroke future King Beyond the Wall in Mance Rayder, a future Lord Commander of the Watch in Jon Snow, and a future Lord of Winterfell stroke King in the North in Robb Stark, all under one roof, though Jon and Robb couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Mance's memory here serves to further highlight the triangular dynamics between the Watch, the Free Folk, and Winterfell that we've seen come to the fore many times in our study of the history of the Watch. And of course, in the current story, Jon finds himself in the middle of that triangle as a Lord Commander who lived with and loved the Free Folk, touted as the potential Lord of Winterfell by King Stannis Baratheon.
As a ranger, Mance Rayder would venture north of the Wall, which reminded him of his roots and gave him a taste of freedom away from the Watch. Qhorin Halfhand, a ranger from the Shadow Tower who knew Mance well, tells Jon, "He liked women, Mance did, and he was not a man whose knees bent easily, that's true. But it was more than that. He loved the wild better than the Wall. It was in his blood. When he left the Shadow Tower, he was only going home again."
Although Qhorin implies that Mance left the Watch for a woman or for pride, we eventually get to hear the story from Mance himself. Sometime during the early days of Jeor Mormont's time as Lord Commander, Mance was sent ranging north of the Wall, and his party killed a large elk to eat. He says, "We were skinning it when the smell of blood drew a shadow cat out of its lair. I drove it off, but not before it shredded my cloak to ribbons. It shredded my arm and back as well, and I bled worse than the elk. My brothers feared I might die before they got me back to Maester Mullin at the Shadow Tower, so they carried me to a wildling village where we knew an old wise woman that did some healing. She was dead, as it happened, but her daughter saw to me, cleaned my wounds, sewed me up, and fed me porridge and potions until I was strong enough to ride again. And she sewed up the rents in my cloak as well, with some scarlet silk from a shy that her grandmother had pulled from the wreck of a cog washed up on the frozen shore. It was the greatest treasure she had, and her gift to me. But at the Shadow Tower I was given a new wool cloak from stores, black and trimmed with black, to go with my black breeches and black boots, my black doublet and black mail. The new cloak had no frays or rips nor tears, and most of all, no red. The men of the Night's Watch dressed in black, Sir Dennis Mallister reminded me sternly, as if I had forgotten. My old cloak was fit for burning now, he said. I left the next morning for a place where a kiss was not a crime and a man could wear any cloak he chose.
So Mance was drawn to the freedom beyond the Wall, in contrast to the strict, uniformed lifestyle of the Watch. And when he says that he left for a place where a kiss was not a crime, it might be a hint that the wise woman's daughter was more than just his caregiver, or perhaps simply an allusion to what Qhorin told Jon. He liked women. In hindsight, perhaps the Watch should have been more cautious about letting a former member of the Free Folk, who loved to sing about Bael the Bard, go ranging in Free Folk territory. And we wonder what Jorah Mormont thought when news arrived at Castle Black that the deserter Mance had not only become king beyond the wall, but had successfully united the Free Folk into one giant host.
Ostensibly, the Free Folk posed a threat to Jorah's Night's Watch, but of course Mance was really trying to take his people south of the wall to escape the reach of the real enemy, the Others, who had the power to freeze them to death and turn them into undead zombies, as they did to Tormund Giantsbane's son Torwynd, and who knows how many other Free Folk.
And during the main story, Mance made the audacious decision to scale the wall by himself and infiltrate Winterfell incognito, posing as a singer in order to size up King Robert Baratheon on his visit north to convince Ned to become his hand. Inspired by Bael the Bard, he fell in with Robert's entourage south of Winterfell and ultimately took part in the welcoming feast, spying on the families he knew he'd have to take on if he was to take his people south of the wall. Just like the time Lord Commander Corgyle visited Winterfell, there were many interesting characters pertinent to today's discussion, all under one roof. Mance wasn't recognized by Ned or Benjen, with the latter having never met him in person, and so the king beyond the wall was able to observe the scene freely, feasting on the Starks' meat and mead.
Altogether, Mance embodies the contrast between an institutionalized lifestyle and one of near total freedom. As a former Black brother, he knows their strengths and weaknesses, making him a more interesting and more formidable enemy to the Watch. Lord Commander Mormont is painfully aware of the threat Mance poses, having sent rangers north of the wall on scouting expeditions. So let's briefly consider those rangers who put their lives on the line to bring news of Mance Rayder to Castle Black.
Yeah, we've mentioned Qhorin Halfhand, a leading ranger from the Shadow Tower. He's noted to have been friends with Mance before his desertion and is competent enough to lead 100 men out of the Shadow Tower to meet Jorah Mormont's contingent at the Fist of the First Men. As for his Halfhand moniker, when Jon meets him, he thinks only thumb and forefinger remained on the hand that held the reins. The other fingers had been sheared off, catching a wildling's axe that would otherwise have split his skull. It was told that he had thrust his maimed fist into the face of the axeman so the blood spurted into his eyes and slew him while he was blind. Since that day, the wildlings beyond the wall had known no foe more implacable.
Training himself to fight with his weak hand, Qhorin became, quote, half a legend in the Watch, a man of slow words and swift action. And like a true hero, Qhorin ultimately sacrifices himself so Jon can live, ordering the fledgling recruit to slaughter him to feign a betrayal to the Watch in order to infiltrate the Free Folk and find out more about why they're assembling en masse by the Milkwater.
Also in Qhorin's party, ordered to scout the Skirling Pass by Jorah Mormont, were Squire Dalbridge, Ebben, and Stone Snake, as well as Jon, giving us a team of a swordsman, an archer, an interrogator, a climber, and a novice learning the game. Dalbridge, who apparently squired for King Jaehaerys II, was a veteran ranger and a renowned archer. It's not mentioned when he joined the Watch, but it seems likely that it was after Aerys' death. Unfortunately, Dalbridge was killed when the group was discovered by Free Folk, and he remained behind to hold off the pursuers while his brothers made their escape.
Ebben had been in the Watch since he was a boy, and was known for his unflinching attitude when called upon to interrogate the foe. He was captured and killed by a band of Free Folk led by Rattleshirt after Qhorin ordered him back to the Fist of the First Men with news of what they had discovered so far for Lord Commander Mormont. When Jon ultimately arrived at the Wildling camp, he was shown his former comrade's head and told that he died bravely.
And finally, there's Stone Snake, the noted climber in the group. When Mance asks Ygritte about how many men were in the Night's Watch party, she says 5, 3's dead and the boy's here. The other went up a mountainside where no horse could follow. And so the fate of Stone Snake remains a mystery. Since he hasn't returned to the wall, we're left to speculate on his whereabouts. Surely George kept him alive for a reason. Could he have found evidence of the others on the other side of the mountain and started tracking them instead of returning home? And could he have found lost ranger Benjen Stark en route?
Yeah, Benjen's fate is another mystery readers want to see resolved. It's implied that he first considered joining the Watch as a young boy at the tourney of Harrenhal, when a wandering crow, a Night's Watch recruiter that might or might not have been Euron, appealed for new members. Benjen was the Stark in Winterfell during Robert's rebellion, as his older brother Ned led the northern troops on Robert's side after the deaths of their father, Rickard, and their brother Brandon.
Why Benjen made the final decision to join the Watch after the rebellion is unknown, but he was surely emotionally affected by the tragedies of the Civil War, and we wonder what the conversations between him and Aemon were like with that in mind, a Stark and a Targaryen, devastated by the rebellion, on opposite sides, yet bound by brotherhood. Aemon's great-nephew Aerys had killed Benjen's brother and father after Aemon's other kinsman Rhaegar had, quote, kidnapped Benjen's sister. We'd love to have been flies on the wall when these two watchmen were left alone together.
However it came about, with a Stark lineage safe following the birth of Ned's son Robb, Benjen became a Black Brother. As a combatant ranger from Winterfell, he rose through the ranks to become First Ranger. When Mance tells Jon about his incognito trip to Winterfell, he says that not only did he want to evaluate Robert, king to king, but he also wanted to, quote, get the measure of your uncle Benjen as well. He was First Ranger by then, and the bane of all my people.
So Benjen was clearly a force to be reckoned with, ultimately sent beyond the wall to investigate the disappearance of Waymar Royce. As we mentioned earlier, 2 of the dozen companions who accompanied him, Othar and Jafer, returned to Castle Black as whites, but Benjen's fate is as unclear as Stone Snake's. While some fans wondered if Cold Hands, the mysterious undead ranger who accompanied Bran's party on their journey north in A Dance with Dragons, could be Benjen, George has ruled this out with his editor Anne Grohl. With Benjen being a Stark, it seems highly unlikely that we'll never hear from him again, because given his apparent off-page encounter with the others, the storytelling potential is simply too juicy.
Could it be that Benjen, possibly with Stone Snake, might provide our window into the lands of Always Winter? Could they gather information essential to defeating the others and give us details on their organization and culture? And could this information be conveyed to us in a prologue or an epilogue so that we get a glimpse at the secret world of the others firsthand? The mystery of Benjen's disappearance is exciting for readers, firing our imaginations with the distinct possibility of an intriguing POV chapter set in the realm of the others. One thing's for certain, if Benjen comes back into the story, he's going to have fascinating stories to tell.
But currently, Benjen isn't around to see life at the Wall under the command of his nephew Jon Snow. The Watch has been on an arc of decline, and the fact that seasoned and accomplished members like Benjen, Garrett, Qhorin, Stone Snake, Ebon, Dalbridge, and Mormont are all either dead or absent from the roster compounds the feeling that the Brotherhood is falling apart with not enough heroes and too many unsavory characters. Given the dearth of experienced and honorable characters, it's no surprise that there was a mutiny in A Storm of Swords, and from a meta perspective, we can guess why George has chosen the current timeline for the late-stage decline of the Watch.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that this decline is escalating while the others are preparing to attack. George wants the Night's Watch to be weakened in the lead-up to the zombie apocalypse, raising tension, giving the big bad an advantage, and ultimately setting the stage for some of the characters we know and love to step up as heroes.
And now, having charted the woes of the Watch throughout the histories and up to the current story, including the deaths and disappearances of several competent members, let's next take a close look at those who remain at Castle Black to one day oppose the others. It's time to consider the colorful cast of characters dressed in all black and where their collective story is heading as we consider the Night's Watch story in A Song of Ice and Fire, from Jon Snow's arrival at Castle Black to his final chapter of A Dance with Dragons. Will shared Garrett's unease. He had been 4 years on the Wall. The first time he had been sent beyond, all the old stories had come rushing back and his bowels had turned to water. He had laughed about it afterward. He was a veteran of 100 rangings by now, and the endless dark wilderness that the Southron called the Haunted Forest had no more terrors for him. Until tonight. Something was different tonight.
The opening prologue of A Game of Thrones highlights the importance of the Night's Watch from the outset, as well as establishing the others as the lurking big bad that would one day come to the fore. The opening gambit, "We should start back," Garrett urged as the woods began to grow dark around them, sets the tone for a short horror story designed to hook readers into the saga.
We follow 3 Night's Watch Rangers as they scout the haunted forest, tracking a band of free folk raiders, and although events are detailed via Will's point of view, he's mainly a passive observer to the growing tension between seasoned ranger Garrett and young recruit Waymar Royce. And through this rivalry, George layers in commentary about the ranks of the Watch and society as a whole in Westeros.
Yeah, the Garrett versus Waymar tension comes from their inherent contrasts. The former is, quote, an old man past 50, the latter 18 in charge of his first ranging. While the age difference, as well as their experience as rangers, is a big contrast, they also have very different backgrounds, with Garrett having been poor and low-born, and Waymar being the youngest son from a noble house. George conveys this privilege by detailing the young man's garb. It says, he wore black leather boots, black woolen pants, black moleskin gloves, and a fine supple coat of gleaming black ringmail over layers of black wool and boiled leather. Sir Waymar had been a sworn brother of the Night's Watch for less than half a year, but no one could say he had not prepared for his vocation, at least insofar as his wardrobe was concerned.
Notice the little jibe in the thoughts of Will, who's also low-born, before we get descriptions of both men's swords to underscore their difference in class, while Waymar wields a splendid castle-forged longsword with jewels in its hilt. Garrett's weapon was, quote, a short, ugly thing, its grip discolored by sweat, its edge nicked from hard use.
And this contrast doesn't just commentate on the class system within the Watch, but also Westeros as a whole, a land where high birth gives you access to wealth and privilege out of reach for the so-called small folk. And so with differences in class, age and levels of experience, the pair make interesting foils, giving us conflict from the first paragraph. "Do the dead frighten you?" Sir Waymar Royce asked with just the hint of a smile. Garrett did not rise to the bait.
While Waymar's snooty attitude is designed to get under our skin, with his arrogance and refusal to heed sound advice, he is at least determined to succeed at his first ranging. He questions Will about the mysterious deaths of the Free Folk party thoroughly, and isn't about to start back until his questions have been answered. The problem is, there are clear hints to the reader that he's leading his men into danger. When Will thinks, something was different tonight, we know there's going to be trouble.
And it's worth considering the dynamics of the group as a whole here. We've discussed the team that Mormont sent to scout the free folk at the Skirling Pass, and how each one had a talent to add to the group. Here we have Will, who is noted to be a good tracker and spy. It says, no one could move through the woods as silent as Will, and it had not taken the Black brothers long to discover his talent. Then you have Garrett, a man of the Watch for over 40 years, an experienced ranger and one of Mormont's best men. Finally, there's Waymar, who as a high-born, physically capable young man, much like Jon Snow, would have had a martial upbringing that no doubt saw him excel in the Castle Black training yard.
Ostensibly, this sounds like a good mix for a ranging expedition trio. However, as we mentioned earlier, Mormont's mistake was in giving command to the least experienced member of the crew. The Lord Commander says to Tyrion, "The Royce boy was as green as summer grass, yet he insisted on the honor of his own command, saying it was his due as a knight. I didn't wish to offend his Lord Father, so I yielded. I sent him out with 2 men I deemed as good as any in the Watch. More fool I."
But while Mormont's regret was justified, and with several clues that Waymar's inexperience was showing, he's noted by Will to be riding the wrong type of horse and swinging an unsuitable sword between the close trees. This doesn't tell the whole story. When the others emerged and challenged him, Waymar did not collapse in fear, as we might have expected, but instead showed his mettle. "Dance with me, then," he said to his adversary, even though he was outnumbered in the biting cold. From his vantage point high up in a sentinel tree, Will observed the scene. He lifted his sword high over his head, defiant. His hands trembled from the weight of it, or perhaps from the cold. Yet in that moment, Will thought he was a boy no longer, but a man of the Night's Watch.
The chapter might have begun with conflict between two bickering men, but in the end we see the others, who ultimately add Will and Waymar to their ranks of the undead, emerge as a common enemy, making the human disputes look trivial. The chapter not only sets up the story for the Night's Watch, but establishes the theme of a greater threat overshadowing human politics, a theme that will continue throughout the saga. While the focus of the series soon shifts to a civil war in the South, the reader senses an invasion by these others will one day mark the climax of the series, and that the Night's Watch will be inextricably linked to that eventuality. The Watch might have forgotten their true purpose, but they will soon remember.
With the Night's Watch's endgame having been established in the prologue, George then needed to lay the foundations for the story he was going to tell. A war with the others might be the destination, but what would happen on the journey? The first thing George needed was a central character to move to Castle Black who could experience life in the Night's Watch, starting as a new recruit to give us an arc. That character was Jon Snow, the bastard of House Stark, who felt like a misfit in his own family.
Being a bastard in George's world, Jon carried a sense of dishonor with him at all times, and being made to sit below the salt at Robert's welcoming feast at Winterfell highlighted that he was treated differently than his siblings. And so the idea of joining the Watch appealed to him because he perceived it as an honorable and equitable calling. When his uncle Benjen tried to dampen Jon's drunken ambitions of joining the Watch, he said, "You don't know what you're asking, Jon. The Night's Watch is a sworn brotherhood. We have no families. None of us will ever father sons. Our wife is duty. Our mistress is honor."
When Jon replies, "A bastard can have honor too. I am ready to swear your oath," his motive for joining the Watch is laid out in full view. And so when Tyrion cruelly mocks the reality of life at Castle Black, this cuts deep for Jon and adds to the cruel misery of his disenfranchisement, given that in contrast his half-brother Robb is being prepared to one day inherit Winterfell. And soon after arriving at Castle Black, Jon saw the truth in Tyrion's assessment, thinking, no one had told him the Night's Watch would be like this, no one except Tyrion Lannister.
In Jon's third chapter of A Game of Thrones, we see Castle Black through a new recruit's eyes. Jon is part of a group of around 20 new arrivals, but despite Benjen's encouragement that these men were not strangers but his brothers, Jon feels alone. Alistair Thorne is hard on the group in the training yard and has taken a particular dislike to Jon, who he mockingly labels Lord Snow. Even his supposed brothers dislike him, given he continually humiliates them at swordplay. But we soon see that dislike is a two-way street.
Jon followed the rest back to the armory, walking alone. He often walked alone here. There were almost 20 in the group he trained with, yet not one he could call a friend. Most were 2 or 3 years his senior, yet not one was half the fighter Robb had been at 14. Daeron was quick but afraid of being hit. Pip used his sword like a dagger. Jeren was as weak as a girl. Gren slow and clumsy. Halder's blows were brutally hard, but he ran right into your attacks. The more time he spent with them, the more Jon despised them.
So even though Jon feels unfairly treated on account of his birth, he's still far more privileged than most of the Watch, though he doesn't realize it. It takes the armorer Donald Noy, who as a former liegeman of House Baratheon recognizes privilege, to point out exactly why the other recruits dislike Jon. It's not that he is better than them, it's because he acts like he's better than them, putting us in mind of Waymar Royce. This is a lesson in humility for Jon, who takes Noy's talk to heart.
Realizing that his fellows have never held a proper sword, let alone owned one, Jon apologizes to Grenn for his aggression. He says, "I'm sorry about your wrist. Robb used the same move on me once, only with a wooden sword. It hurt like 7 hells, but yours must be worse. Look, if you want, I can show you how to defend that." And so Jon begins to bond with the other recruits, and the anguish he'd felt over being the outcast at Winterfell translates into empathy for his new brothers.
Yeah, and Jon is particularly protective of a nervous recruit called Sam Tarly. When he first lays eyes on him, it says, he beheld the fattest boy he had ever seen standing in the door of the armory. By the look of him, he must have weighed 20 stone. The fur collar of his embroidered surcoat was lost beneath his chins. Pale eyes moved nervously in a great round moon of a face, and plump, sweaty fingers wiped themselves on the velvet of his doublet. They told me I was to come here for training, he said to no one in particular.
And in the training yard, Thorne afforded not the faintest drop of mercy for Sam. Instead, he encouraged the trainees to keep attacking Sam, even after he had yielded. Jon takes pity on the boy, listens to his backstory of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of his martial father Randall, and makes the decision to help him. He tells the other recruits not to attack Sam in the yard, and when the cruel Rast refuses, Jon uses his direwolf ghost to threaten him. It says, "From that day forth, neither Rast nor any of the others would hurt Samwell Tarly. When Sir Alliser matched them against him, they would stand their ground and swat aside his slow, clumsy strokes. If the Master-at-Arms screamed for an attack, they would dance and tap Sam lightly on the breastplate or helm or leg. Sir Alliser raged and threatened and called them all cravens and women and worse, yet Sam remained unhurt."
So Jon's protection of Sam helps to not only establish Jon as a leader, but also bonds the group together. It's not long before Jon realizes that Benjen was right after all, and that these recruits really are his brothers. At this juncture, we should consider the dynamics of the group we meet early at Castle Black, as some will become integral to Jon's journey.
Yeah, there's Jon, the gifted swordsman and leader, who is mentally astute enough to be groomed for leadership early on by Mormont when he's assigned to the stewards and not the rangers. Then there's his also highborn bestie, Sam Tarly, who is essentially a nerd, more suited to reading and studying than scrapping in the training yard. Sam finally finds his identity within the Watch when Jon makes a plea to Maester Aemon to employ him as his assistant. Using the clever metaphor of a maester's chain, which is composed of many metals, Jon makes the case that the Watch also requires all sorts to function properly. Aemon ultimately sends his illiterate assistant Chet to work with the dogs and brings the castle-educated Sam into the role instead.
But while these are both major point-of-view characters, George also needed secondary and tertiary characters to bring Jon's group to life. And so we have Pip, an ex-mummer who's a fiercely loyal friend and loves to jape. Then there's Grenn, a huge, strong young man with a thick neck dubbed Aurochs by Sir Alliser. Despite his loyalty, he's noted for being less intelligent than some of his peers, which feeds into some light-hearted comic ribbing. And while Pip and Grenn have their share of funny moments, the real source of comic relief in Jon's friendship circle comes from Ed Tollett, nicknamed Dolorous Ed.
Yeah, he's one of the most quotable comic characters in the series, always ready to lighten up a scene, or should we say dampen, with his persistently amusing commentary coloured by his innate depression. So let's look at some moments of hilarity and analyse his brand of comedy. Starting with this. "The dead are likely dull fellows, full of tedious complaints. The ground's too cold. My gravestone should be larger. Why does he get more worms than I do?"
Yeah, Ed's moments of comedy are nearly always a downer, commenting on depressing subjects. Take this one. "I never win anything. The gods always smiled on Wat, though. When the wildlings knocked him off the Bridge of Skulls, somehow he landed in a nice deep pool of water. How lucky was that, missing all those rocks?" Then Grenn says, "Was it a long fall? Did landing in the pool of water save his life?" And Ed replies, No, he was dead already from that axe in his head. Still, it was pretty lucky missing those rocks.
Yeah, and often his quips involve accounts of his bad luck. Take this one. Some dogs crawled atop me during the night. My cloak was almost dry when one of them pissed in it. Or perhaps it was Brown Bernard. Have you noticed that the rain stopped the instant I had a roof above me? It will start again now that I'm back out. Gods and dogs alike delight to piss on me.
And apparently, possibly also one of his Night's Watch brothers. Ned's bleak comments provide dark comedy in some difficult situations with the Night's Watch. He captures the gloominess of life at the Wall and reflects it in a dry way to keep us smiling throughout those chapters. As a character archetype, George is surely drawing on Eeyore, Winnie the Pooh's amusingly dour companion. When Eeyore says, "It's the only cloud in the sky and it's drizzling right on me. Somehow I'm not surprised." We can imagine Ed Tollett saying exactly the same thing.
The evening meal was almost done by the time he and Ghost reached the common hall. A group of the Black brothers were dicing over mulled wine near the fire. His friends were at the bench nearest the west wall, laughing. Pip was in the middle of a story. The mama's boy with the big ears was a born liar with 100 different voices, and he did not tell his tales so much as live them, playing all the parts as needed, a king one moment and a swineherd the next. When he turned into an alehouse girl or a virgin princess, he used a high falsetto voice that reduced them all to tears of helpless laughter, and his eunuchs were always eerily accurate caricatures of Sir Alistair.
So it's not all misery at the Wall. When John settles in, he realizes there's plenty of friendship and camaraderie within the Institute. And while his inner circle are important characters he comes to view as his found family, George needed many more to make Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower feel lived in. And despite the decline in numbers over the years, the author still had to give the impression of nearly 1,000 people.
And so there are many lesser-mentioned characters in the Watch that bring the Brotherhood to life. In John's recruitment group, in addition to Sam, Pip and Gren, there's the ugly Toddy, aka Toad, the tough Holder, as well as Mathar, Albert and Jeren. There's the singer Darion, who John will choose to become a wandering crow in A Feast for Crows, only for him to be executed by Arya in Bravos when she judges him to be a deserter. And then there's Rast, who was an early antagonist in the training yard.
For those at Castle Black who follow the Seven, Septon Celador is ready to serve, at least when he's not too far into his cups. Brothers in need of medical treatment can seek out Maesters Aemon, Harmune, and Mullen at Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower, respectively. And if you're hungry, crowd around Three Finger Hob and Hake as they cook up a nice warm stew of venison, thick barley, onion, and carrot, with a side of mashed yellow turnip. It really does take all sorts to keep the Night's Watch ticking, and in that, John was correct. The Institute's diversity is its strength.
But not everybody adds something positive to the Brotherhood. The reader identifies John's core group as the good guys. We can't imagine the likes of Sam, Gren, Pip or Ed betraying each other or causing too much trouble at the Wall. However, given all that's said about there being too many unsavoury characters taking the black, George had to counterbalance the good characters with a group representing the decline of the Watch. He even gave one of them his own POV chapter.
Yeah, we've mentioned how Chet was ousted from his cushy job serving Aemon after John's endorsement of Sam. Well, that plot thread didn't just evaporate, and in fact it led to pivotal moments for the Night's Watch. A Clash of Kings saw Jorah Mormont lead the Watch north of the Wall on a great ranging meant to seek answers to the disappearances of Benjen Stark and Waymar Royce, among other things. That ranging would lead to John being sent further north with Qhorin Halfhand, with the greater force of the Watch remaining encamped at the Fist of the First Men. Through Chet's point of view, the prologue of A Storm of Swords, we learn the details of his planned mutiny that would see him and his accomplices murdering Mormont and other officers at the Fist. And since Chet hadn't forgotten how Sam Tarly stole his job, he ultimately planned to kill him too, which would cut the line of Raven communications back to Castle Black.
The group of conspirators number 14 in total: Chet, Lark the Sisterman, Small Paul, Dirk, Clubfoot Carl, Ollo Lophand, Sweet Donald Hill, Sorwood, Softfoot, Maslin, Rolly of Sisterton, who is Lark's cousin, and 3 unnamed others. Of this group, tight focus is given to the first 3, Chet, Lark the Sisterman, and Small Paul. Now in charge of the dogs thanks to Jon Snow, Chet plans to unleash them to frighten away the horses to allow him and his group to escape. Lark, who dreams of returning home to the sisters, is to kill Dywyn and Bannon. Small Paul is a more sympathetic character, resembling Lenny Small from John Steinbeck's novella of Mice and Men. Paul is ironically named a large, strong man who loves animals and is easily influenced. He is being used by the mutineers as muscle for their scheme.
Chet's plan is foiled when it begins to snow, meaning that the deserters would leave an obvious trail and be followed. He decides to kill Sam regardless, but that plan is also foiled when the others attack the Fist of the First Men with their army of the undead, routing the Watch. Chet wets himself and runs away, showing he's a worse coward than Sam, who also wets himself, but tries his best to send ravens amidst the chaos. We later learn that Chet was killed and becomes a White-Off page. Lark suffers the same fate.
As for Paul, when Samwell trudges behind the fleeing Night's Watch, sobbing and struggling, wishing he were dead, Gren and Paul attempt to help Sam, but the trio are confronted by an other. Gren and Paul attack it, and though Paul is killed, he inadvertently knocks the being off balance. Then Sam steps up and stabs the other with the obsidian blade that Ghost found wrapped up in a black cloak of the Watch near the Fist of the First Men. Sam becomes the first person we know of to kill another for 8,000 years. He's later mockingly referred to as Slayer by his fellows, but the reader realizes just how much courage it took the self-confessed coward to do the deed.
Sam will eventually flee from Craster's Keep with Craster's daughter Gilly, but as they shelter in a deserted free folk village, a whited small paw attacks. Just when all seems lost, Sam is able to shove a smoldering log down Paul's throat. Given whites are vulnerable to fire, Paul is killed, and now Sam had killed an other and one very large white. Slayer indeed. Outside, all hope seems lost when a crowd of whites notice Sam, including the whites formerly known as Chet and Lark. But both undead conspirators are chased away by Cold Hands and Bloodraven's flock of ravens.
But that's not the end of the mutineer plot thread. What we skipped over is that when members of the Watch sought shelter and sustenance at Craster's Keep after their flight from the Fist, echoes of Chet's plan come to the fore. With a number of the Black Brothers dissatisfied with Craster's lack of generosity, with both his food and his daughter wives, Dirk, supported by Clubfoot Carl, slits Craster's throat, and in the ensuing melee, Ollo Lophand fatally stabs Lord Commander Mormont. And of course, Dirk, Carl and Ollo were all part of Chet's original plot.
While the mutineers remained at Craster's in the short term, some eventually meet their match in A Dance with Dragons when they encounter the enigmatic Cold Hands. Ollo Lophand is the only one confirmed to have met his end, given Bran sees a one-handed corpse through his wolf Summer's eyes, and though Summer sees as many corpses as the fingers on a dead man's paw, we're left to wonder who else Cold Hands dispose of. Dirk and Carl are among those unaccounted for and could be 2 of the 5 killed by Cold Hands, though it's worth noting that of the original conspirators, not all took part in the mutiny at Craster's, since Sweet Donald Hill is noted to be one of those who returned to Castle Black.
And so, with Jon persuading Aemon into taking on Sam, causing such resentment in Chet, we see how much chaos an immoral and disgruntled member of the Watch can cause his Black Brothers. Craster's murder betrayed the tradition of guest right, and the Lord Commander's death at the hands of his brothers marked the nadir of the long decline of the Night's Watch we've described.
And with the Great Ranging resulting in the further diminishment of the Night's Watch, Mance Rayder was ready to take full advantage. He sent various parties to climb the wall or draw out the watch in order to facilitate a full-scale attack. Still posing as a Night's Watch turncloak, Jon heads south and scales the wall with a group led by Styr, the Magnar Then. In a tense scene outside Queen's Crown, Jon turns his cloak again, fleeing for Castle Black to give word of Mance's plans and to help fortify the defenses. In his time with the Free Folk, Jon had learned to respect them, and although his self-identity was tested, ultimately his blood ran black. The question was, would anyone believe him?
When Rattleshirt was captured by the men from Eastwatch at the abandoned castle at Long Barrow, it would be only a matter of time before the story of Jon killing Qhorin Halfhand reached Castle Black. By this time, Bowen Marsh, acting Castellan, had left Castle Black to deal with further wildling incursions, engaging in a bloody battle against the Weeper at the Bridge of Skulls in the west. Here Marsh had fallen into Mance Rayder's trap, leaving behind a ragtag weakened force supervised by the aged and witless Sir Winton Stout to defend Castle Black. Stout, who had once come a dozen votes short of being Lord Commander, was no longer capable of much at all and had been left in charge solely due to his status as a knight.
Fortunately, with the Night's Watch more vulnerable than ever, Donal Noy takes unofficial charge and, satisfied with the story Jon told of his temporary defection, delegates some of the organizational duties to the young steward. At this point, we should remember all the historical invasions led by a king beyond the wall. Usually those tales involve the Stark of Winterfell rolling up with a northern host to smash the free folk. Yet in this era of the War of the Five Kings, the Night's Watch couldn't call on Winterfell for assistance. Almost all the fighting men of the North had traveled south with Robb Stark, with Winterfell itself being taken by Theon Greyjoy, then burned by Ramsay Snow.
With Styr and his men attacking the vulnerable Watch from the south, the Battle of Castle Black was a close call. Jon and Donal Noy managed to save the day by lighting tactical fires around the wooden staircase by the wall. It says, "With the flames below and the flames above, the wildlings had nowhere to go. Some continued upward and died. Some went downward and died. Some stayed where they were. They died as well. Many leapt from the steps before they burned, and died from the fall. 20-odd Thens were still huddled together between the fires when the ice cracked from the heat, and the whole lower third of the stair broke off, along with several tons of ice. That was the last that Jon Snow saw of Styr, the Magnar of Then. The wall defends itself, he thought."
But the Free Folk weren't done yet. Styr's attack had been probing the defenses. Now Mance Rayder brought forth his main host to try and ram and fight their way through the tunnels at Castle Black and cross beneath the wall. Looking down from the top of the wall at the scene, Jon sees that mammoths centered the wildling line, 100 or more with giants on their backs, clutching mauls and huge stone axes. More giants loped beside them, pushing along a tree trunk on great wooden wheels, its end sharpened to a point. A ram, he thought bleakly. If the gate still stood below, a few kisses from that thing would soon turn it into splinters.
Fortunately, the Night's Watch repelled the attacks to the gate from giants and mammoths and even a defensive turtle, though the battle did have its casualties. Donal Noy was killed defending the tunnel, his spine crushed by Mag the Mighty, while simultaneously slaying the Giant King with his blade. But although Jon was leading the defences at that point, his stint in charge didn't last long.
Yeah, having questioned Rattleshirt at Eastwatch, Alliser Thorne and the newly arrived Janos Slynt arrived at Castle Black to arrest the man they deemed to have betrayed the Watch, imprisoning him in the ice cells pending judgment. Slynt had been sent to the wall by Tyrion for his corruption as commander of the City Watch in King's Landing and his role in the killing of the royal bastard Baby Bara. With Thorne, Slint was quickly established as a nemesis to Jon, though Jon fortunately wasn't without friends of his own at the Wall. Maester Aemon vouches for him, and when the pair realized that executing Jon might prove unpopular, they send him on a suicide mission to treat with and assassinate Mance Rayder in his camp beyond the Wall.
And it's while he's with Mance that Jon watches the surprise attack from Stannis Baratheon and a contingent from Eastwatch, routing the less disciplined ranks of the Free Folk host. Stannis later tells Jon, "I killed 1,000 wildlings, took another 1,000 captives, and scattered the rest." So at this point, the Night's Watch have to make some key decisions. With Jeor Mormont dead, not only do they have to select a new Lord Commander, but they also have to figure out what to do with all the free folk that haven't joined the 6,000 refugees heading towards Hardhome.
With a bitter rivalry between commanders Cotter Pike at Eastwatch and Dennis Mallister at the Shadow Tower, the situation reached a fever pitch during the election for a new Lord Commander that ultimately reached a stalemate between these two leading candidates. With Janos Slynt's campaign as Tywin Lannister's endorsed candidate picking up pace and Stannis demanding a quick solution after 9 days of voting, Samwell Tarly sought to influence the Watch toward picking Jon as their new leader. When he managed to convince Cotter and Dennis Mallister to drop their campaigns, and with each man satisfied that the other couldn't win, Jon won the final vote. His boy-to-man leadership arc reached a new level, and Jon became the 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch.
While Jon was democratically elected, that didn't mean he had the full support of the Watch. Having been detained in an ice cell for killing Corin Halfhand, or as the story went, betraying the Watch, there were still some men who despised him. In particular, Jon had to consider what to do about the two men he knew would take every opportunity to undermine his power, Slynt and Thorne. So in his nascent days as commander, Jon realised he had to split the men up. He ordered Slynt to command the castle at Greyguard, which really wasn't a terrible deal for the former commander of the City Watch.
But, not used to life at the Wall, Slynt defied Jon's wishes and refused to go. This led to one of the most memorable scenes in the series. Unable to make Slynt fall in line and aware he needed to make decisive decisions in his new leadership role, Jon publicly ordered the execution of the dissenter to be hanged from atop the wall. Until he remembered the lessons his father had taught him. The scene goes like this. "If the boy thinks that he can frighten me, he is mistaken. He would not dare hang me. Janos Slynt has friends, important friends, you'll see." The wind whipped away the rest of his words. This is wrong, Jon thought. "Stop!" Emmett turned back, frowning. "My lord?" "I will not hang him," said Jon. "Bring him here." "Oh, Seven, save us!" he heard Bowen Marsh cry out. The smile that Lord Janos Slynt smiled then had all the sweetness of rancid butter, until Jon said, "Ed, fetch me a block," and unsheathed Longclaw.
When Jon proceeded to behead Janos, he at once solidified himself as a decisive leader and reaffirmed himself as a true man of the North, ready to administer swift justice himself to the dissenting Night's Watchman, much like Ned Stark in the first chapter of A Game of Thrones. It's a simple yet satisfying comparison, though as readers we realise Janos was far more deserving of Night's Watch justice than Garrod. Jon was now the Lord Commander in earnest, killing the boy and letting the man be born. When King Stannis nods his approval, we know that Jon now commands respect.
However, Janos was not the final obstacle for Jon in his leadership arc. When Jon makes the decision to allow the free folk south of the Wall, it exacerbates his reputation among some at the Watch as a betrayer. Chief among his rivals is Bowen Marsh, who, having corresponded with Tywin Lannister, was sympathetic to Janos Slynt's cause. Furthermore, Bowen had been injured by the Free Folk at the Bridge of Skulls when the Night's Watch took heavy losses against the Weeper.
And although many readers despise Bowen Marsh for his attitude to Jon, it's worth considering his point of view. Marsh was an injured war hero who dedicated his life to an organization that he understood existed for the purpose of fending off incursions by the Free Folk. He had recently suffered this injury as he watched a third of the force he commanded die, and he then watched the new Lord Commander, who'd been accused of joining the ranks of the enemy, allow those same enemies south of the wall. It's perhaps no wonder that Melisandre begins to have visions of Jon with enemies all around him.
Admittedly, Jon made an unprecedented decision when he allowed the Free Folk south, and we can understand how much that must have rankled Marsh. But Marsh's viewpoint is colored by the central theme in our look at the Watch stretching from the Age of Heroes to the modern timeline. The Night's Watch has forgotten its history, and now that the others have returned, they need to remember their true purpose if they are to truly guard the realms of men. And that means they need to buck some of the current traditions at the Wall and take drastic action. Of course, Jon is going to have to make unprecedented decisions.
But Bowen Marsh can't see the bigger picture. Never mind viewing the Free Folk as fellow humans deserving of empathy. He's too wrapped up in viewing them as the enemy to realise that bringing them south will not only save them, it will prevent the others from expanding their army of the undead. When we learn about the chaos unfolding at Hardhome, outlined in Maester Harmune's desperate letter mentioning dead things in the woods, dead things in the water, the reader understands that Jon's decision is wholly justified. Those 6,000 Free Folk refugees left to be slaughtered by the others will surely one day be set against the Night's Watch.
But the final straw comes for Bowen Marsh when he perceives that Jon is interfering in the politics of the realm. We're told frequently that, quote, the Watch takes no part, but the reality is, and always has been, that the Wall can only be efficiently defended with the help of Winterfell in the north. Stannis offers Jon his old home, with a Free Folk bride no less, in return for the support of the north. While Jon refuses, he can't resist responding when he later receives a taunting letter, ostensibly from Ramsay Snow, now calling himself the true-born Lord of Winterfell.
Stannis had apparently burned Mance Rayder, remembering that on top of being king beyond the wall, Mance was a deserter of the Watch. But really, he'd been switched with the glamoured Rattleshirt. And so Jon was able to send Mance as Abel, a Bael the Bard-inspired minstrel, off to infiltrate Winterfell to free his sister, Arya. Now Ramsay had allegedly captured Mance and was threatening to wage war on the Watch if he didn't get his bride and Theon Greyjoy back. This was too much for Jon, and he responded with immediate plans to lead the Free Folk to Winterfell and defeat Ramsay.
Of course, through Bowen Marsh's eyes, Jon is further soiling the Watch. After Jon's speech at the Shield Hall in response to the pink letter, when the giant 1-1 was ripping Sir Patrick of the Queen's Men apart like a rag doll for trying to steal Val, Melisandre's prophetic visions of Jon with enemies all around him, daggers in the dark, comes to fruition. Bowen Marsh, with Wick Whittlestick and two others, stab him, quote, for the Watch. Jon struggled to defend himself due to his sword hand being stiff and clumsy, a detail dating back to the time he burned Othor and his hand in the Lord Commander's Tower, showing how deftly George threads details throughout his story. Jon's chapters in A Dance with Dragons end with him bleeding out, caught in the jaws of death. It's a typically potent cliffhanger from George, leaving the reader desperate to know what will happen next.
And with our summary of the Night's Watch's storyline through the main series wrapped up, in the next segment we'll conclude our look at the wonderful cast of characters and contemplate what will happen to this legendary 8,000-year-old institution in the Winds of Winter now that all chaos has been unleashed. Winter is coming, and with it the White Walkers. The Wall is where we stop them. The Wall was made to stop them, but the Wall must be manned.
The stabbing of Jon Snow at the end of A Dance with Dragons leaves us with many questions about what will happen to the Night's Watch in the Winds of Winter and beyond. First off, if Jon, as Lord Commander, was the one holding together the fragile peace between the Watch and the Free Folk, what will happen in the immediate aftermath of his assassination?
Yeah, when we last see Castle Black, the giant Wun is going berserk. Selyse's Queensmen are responding, given it's one of their men he's ripping apart. And the leader of the Watch is face down in the snow dying. 3 factions, all in disarray, and no one to keep the peace. There might even be 4 factions if the Night's Watch fights amongst themselves when Jon supporters find out it was Bowen Marsh leading the stabbening.
While a few readers believe Jon is gone from the story for good, with R'hllor having already been established as having the power to resurrect the dead and a practitioner of his worship, Melisandre, conveniently close by, there will still be a critical power vacuum in his absence. The Free Folk will have a great advantage here, given that they have superior numbers to the Watch and the Queen's Men. And so, if all-out chaos is to be averted, some of the characters at Castle Black are going to have to step up and assert themselves as peacekeepers.
First of all, as we mentioned, there's Melisandre, but questions remain about how much influence she has over the Free Folk and the Watch. Besides, she might feel the best move to contain conflict would be to resurrect Jon, so she might be absorbed concentrating on that. Selyse Baratheon might have her own retinue, the Queen's Men, but they are not a large group, and with Stannis either in a crofter's village or on his way to Winterfell, it doesn't seem likely that she'll be able to exert any authority. Besides, she's proven herself so fearful of violence that the most likely course of action for her seems to be either barricading herself and her companions in the King's Tower, or perhaps even fleeing to her new seat at the Night Fort.
So we must look to Free Folk and Night's Watch characters for leadership. One of the individuals that interests us here is the new Master-at-Arms, Leathers. He's around 40, so he has experience, but is still a formidable warrior who could give most knights a run for their money. And remembering that Jon was able to relate to both the Watch and the Free Folk because he'd spent time on both sides, Leathers is much the same, a man of the Free Folk that has joined the Night's Watch. As an important member of both factions and one who can speak to giants in the Old Tongue as a translator, Leathers might be a crucial figure in containing the mayhem at Castle Black.
Yeah, Leathers joined the Watch after Mance's host was defeated, taking his vows at the same weirwood grove used by Jon and Sam. With him was Jax, another Free Folk Night's Watch convert, and Satin, a former sex worker from Old Town, a minor character with somewhat of a cult following in the fandom. In the absence of Dolorous Ed Tollett, who was sent to Longbarrow as part of Jon's attempts to garrison more of the abandoned castles, Satin was promoted to the position of Jon's personal steward in A Dance with Dragons. The common thread with him and Leathers is that Bowen frowns on Jon having elevated both men, finding them unworthy of the Watch, one for being from the Free Folk, the other for being a sex worker. Things will get very interesting when Leathers and Satin, firmly in the Jon camp, find out Bowen was a central part of the assassination.
So, life at Castle Black at the beginning of the Winds of Winter will be chaotic, but here's hoping there are characters who will step up and dampen the conflict between the Watch and the Free Folk, as the historic enemies now need to focus on the common cause of defeating the others. If Jon is resurrected, he could resume his role as Lord Commander, overseeing the integration of the Free Folk, or he could step out of his position, given the technicality that the vows state he must serve until his death.
Whether or not he's Lord Commander, he may still look to lead the defence of the wall in the long term, and it's likely he'll have a lot of influence over what to do about the Free Folk trapped at Hardhome, and what to do about leadership of the North. He'll be hoping Stannis is successful against Ramsay Snow, and that eventually a supportive leader will take over at Winterfell. Could that role now fall to Jon himself? It's not completely out of the question, but there are his surviving Stark siblings to consider as well. The main thing will be that the North is reorganised after the devastation of the War of the Five Kings, with Winterfell ready to aid the Watch as they have done for millennia.
And whoever is going to be in charge, we would hope that some of Jon's plans to defend the wall will be upheld. One of his ideas, and also Stannis' wish, was to man the abandoned Night's Watch castles and try and restore them as fully as possible. And this notion gives us a tiny sense that, with the help of the free folk, the diminished Night's Watch might at least be somewhat restored before the others arrive.
And having said that, we should have a quick recap of who exactly is stationed in the far-flung castles of the Night's Watch, given that they are all still nominally under the command of a Man of the Watch. Beginning in the west, near the Bridge of Skulls, which spans the Milkwater on its route to the Bay of Ice, is Westwatch by the Bridge. Long abandoned, Jon sent men of the Watch to re-garrison it following the Weeper's failed attempt to gain a crossing there, though critically to his relationship with Bowen Marsh, the goal was no longer to prevent free folk from crossing.
The Shadow Tower, long the most westerly manned castle of the Watch, remains under the command of Sir Dennis Mallister. Next to the east is Sentinel Stand, also re-garrisoned by a small contingent of Night's Watchmen. Greyguard is the next castle, which you may recall is where Jon attempted to send Janos Slynt. When that failed, he chose a veteran steward from the Shadow Tower to lead the restoration effort there.
Next east from Greyguard is Stone Door, which Jon settled on Sorin Shieldbreaker of the Free Folk as a place to settle his own people. Borok the Skin Changer was intended to join them there as well. As both Sorin and Borok are present in the Shield Hall on the day Jon was stabbed, it's not clear how far that plan had proceeded.
Hoarfrost Hill is the next castle which Jon had intended to garrison, but no commander had been named to it by the end of A Dance with Dragons. In contrast, the abandoned castle of Icemark had been placed under the command of Bedwick, a seasoned ranger who had accompanied Bowen Marsh at the Bridge of Skulls, with 20 men of the Night's Watch and 10 of Stannis' men serving under him. The next castle is the Night Fort, which, as we've said, has been allocated to Stannis Baratheon as his own seat. Othel Yarwyck and a team of his builders had been sent to begin the restoration and were making progress, though Othel himself was present in the Shield Hall immediately before Jon was stabbed. It's worth noting that we don't know the identity of at least 2 of the knife wielders in the stabbening, and for all we know, Yarwyck could have been among them.
Deep Lake is next to the east and is noted to be garrisoned, though undermanned. Jon had at one point considered bestowing it upon Halleck, brother of Harmer Dogshead, but it's unclear if that came to pass. Morna Whitemask, a witch and leader amongst the free folk, was given Queensgate, once known as Snowgate, to restore as a home for her people. Queensgate is the closest way castle to the west of Castle Black, and so the next previously unmanned castle that Jon garrisoned was to the east, Oakenshield, which was given to Jon's friend and closest ally among the free folk, Tormund Giantsbane.
And Woodswatch by the Pool lies to the east of Oakenshield and has been garrisoned by a small group of men of the Watch, though it's not confirmed who commands. Sable Hall to the east is garrisoned by more free folk under the command of men of the Watch. And Rhymegate, east of Sable Hall, still lies empty at the end of A Dance with Dragons, which brings us to Longbarrow.
When the free folk crossed the wall, Jon had to contend with a number of spearwives, an unfamiliar circumstance since there was hardly a strong tradition of female warriors south of the wall. Ultimately, bearing in mind the tragic story of Dany Flint, Jon decided to send all of the spearwives to a single castle under the command of Ed Tollett and Iron Emmett, 2 men he trusted implicitly. That castle is Longbarrow and is one of several that we can expect to be fully populated with people completely loyal to Lord Commander Snow.
To the east of Longbarrow is Torches, currently manned by men of the Watch, followed by Greenguard, which has been given to the wildling Devon Sealskinner in which to house his clan. And finally, the castle furthest to the east is Eastwatch by the Sea, still under the command of Cotter Pike, but notably left under the control of Sir Glendon Hewitt in Pike's absence on his mission to Hardhome. Hewitt was one of Janos Slynt's cronies who helped to imprison Jon in A Storm of Swords, and so it's unclear how he might react to the mutiny at Castle Black.
All in all, you can see that Jon tried to thoughtfully intersperse members of the Watch with free folk and Stannis' followers to avoid creating pockets where one group might hold sway, by more or less alternating the competing interests across the length of the wall. It seems like Jon was attempting to create a situation where neighbours might learn to work together for their common benefit. To what extent that might have succeeded obviously remains to be seen.
Another of Jon's ideas that we have yet to see results from was to store 2 dead bodies in the ice cells wrapped in chains and experiment to see if the necromantic power of the others travels through the magical wall, remembering that Othor and Jafer Flowers were already wights when they were taken through the wall to Castle Black. Jon was extremely prescient in realizing the importance of answering the question of whether the power of the others to create wights could pass the wall, so keep your eyes on this thread in the Winds of Winter.
Finally, there are Jon's plans to send a number of watchmen elsewhere. Sam Tarly went south to study at Old Town, and given that Maester Aemon went with him and died en route, it's imperative that Sam levels up in order to take on a Maester's role in the Watch. At Old Town, Sam will have the chance to study ancient texts about the Long Night, the Last Hero, Lightbringer, and arcane prophecies, which could make him one of the Watch's most valuable members when the others arrive at the Wall.
And let's not forget Jon's old adversary, Alliser Thorne. After Janos Slynt's death, Jon sent Alliser out ranging with Dywyn, one of the most seasoned rangers in the Watch. Thorne wasn't happy and thought he was being victimized, but internally, Jon considers him a brother despite their tumultuous history. With Jon thinking of Benjen as he gives Thorne his orders, we have to wonder what the ex-Master-at-Arms will discover on the trip and if it will have a bearing on the plot. George might not want to kill off Sir Alliser just yet, because not only is he an effective antagonist against Jon, but seeing his reaction when Jon is one day revealed to be a Targaryen, possibly even a Targaryen king, would be absolutely priceless. As we mentioned, Thorne was a Targaryen loyalist before taking the Black.
So that wraps up our look at the Night's Watch characters, but there is one final character to consider who isn't a man of the Watch. Yet. As Jorah Mormont lay dying, he told Sam, "Tell my son, Jorah, tell him, take the Black, my wish, dying wish." Time will tell if Jorah will learn of this from Sam and redeem himself in Jorah's eyes further into the story, in which case it would open up the possibility of Jon gifting him with the Mormont family blade Longclaw. This would leave Jon empty-handed, unless some legendary sword came into the equation that Jon could wield. And given the prophecies about Lightbringer and the line from the Night's Watch vows, "I am the sword in the darkness," we can't help but wonder if that sword might be limned in flames.
And on that note, recalling ancient prophecy and with the long night surely returning to Westeros, we look forward to seeing how the Black brothers react to a fresh Others invasion and just how much ancient history will repeat itself. One thing seems certain: after thousands of years, the Night's Watch will remember their original purpose and attempt to save the realm from an icy undead invasion. We wait with bated breath to see how that apocalyptic showdown plays out at the Wall. With the decline of the Watch that we've described in this double episode, it's clearly an organization that is down, but not out. Let's hope the Night's Watch will guard the realms of men during the Winds of Winter, even if their wall is destroyed. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks to George R.R. Martin for including so many stories about the Night's Watch, and thanks to Kevin MacLeod for allowing us to use his music in our production. And as usual, we'll end this episode with our thanks to our patrons from the Castle Steel level. Thanks to Tori Loon, AJ, Aegon VI, Alex, Ali B, Ali C, Oakenfist, Brian, Camille, Casey, Cassandra, Charitable Rereadings, Lady Amalthea, Chris, Christian, Sir Clint the Endel, Convenience or Death, Courtney, David, Dimitri B, Dennis, Lady Diana Dane, Esme, Liza, Emily of the Eyrie, Ezra, Felix, Gerald Garcia, Sir Gladworth, Sir Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Ingvild, Something Like a Lawyer, Jim McGeehan, Winter's King, John Aris, Rider of the Ice Dragon, Sonarion the White Storm, Arafinwi and Glorian, Judson, Katie, Lady Kelly, Mistress of the Old Bay of Crabs, Kenneth, Tree Girl, Sir Galahoo of What, Kyle, Laura, Lena Snow, known as the Twilight Star, Lemba, Lynn, Lomas Knight Rider, survivor of the Yeen Sleepover, Lord Leighton with the Highest Tower, Mage Marmot, Monero Geek TV, Maria, Margareta, and our cohort of Matts, Matt A, Matt C, Matt K, Matt L, Matt M, Matt R, as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Maester Mary, Molly, Nimble Nick One Iric, Peter Pebble, Peter, PJ, Paul B, Paul H, King Ray, first of his name, Richard, Brickle Pickle, Sam, Sir Swift, the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sir Larcelot of Bee Hill, Cern, the Rat Chef de Cuisine, Terry, Sir Terence, Knight of the Cedars, Steph Lioness, Valen Valentine, Maiden of the Black Frost, Vance, Quarren Halfhand, and Yvonne. As always, let us know if I've pronounced any of your names wrong, if you have a nickname you'd prefer to use, or if you feel we've left anything out. You can connect with us via Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, or Patreon. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon with a new regular episode. Bye for now.